He summoned her to the palace ballroom as a cruel jest, an orphaned cleaning girl meant to amuse a room full of nobles. But when she descended the staircase, dignity cloaking every step, the air shifted. What began as humiliation unraveled into defiance, desire, and a clash between class and conscience. In a world ruled by bloodlines and power, one night would ignite a reckoning neither of them could control. The palace of Castilla-La Mancha pulsed with restless activity, as though the very stones underfoot were aware that the night would not pass unnoticed. Dust motes swirled through shafts of late afternoon light, the golden haze slanting through arched windows and catching on the polished edges of carved balustrades. From the kitchens to the high balconies, from the servant passages to the private salons, every corner of the sprawling estate bore signs of hurried preparation. Inside the Hall of Columns, where the guests would soon gather beneath crystal chandeliers and frescoed ceilings, the marble floors were scrubbed until their veins gleamed like riverbeds in moonlight. Brass fixtures had been burnished to brilliance, and dozens of beeswax candles were positioned with surgical precision to maximize their glow. The staff moved like a school of fish, swift, practiced, unspoken in their coordination. Footmen adjusted damask draperies, while the chamberlain paced the length of the gallery, his eyes flitting from arrangement to arrangement, never quite satisfied. Servants had been instructed that every corner, every stair, every silver tray and porcelain goblet must shimmer. The upcoming ball was to be one of the most extravagant of the decade, a display not only of the region's affluence, but of its alliance with the powerful House of Mendoza through a forthcoming marriage. In theory, the celebration was noble in intent. In practice, it was a theater of power, a parade of bloodlines, a subtle war of reputations. Camilla didn't belong in any of it. She stood just beyond the arched doorway of the main gallery, holding a bucket in one hand and a linen cloth in the other. Her dress, the plain brown one she wore nearly every day, was damp at the hem where she had knelt moments earlier to scrub a wine stain from the base of a pillar. The scent of beeswax and orange peel clung to her sleeves, her fingers red and raw from the lye. She kept her head lowered as footmen brushed past her, careful to make herself smaller than she already was. No one looked at her. That was the first rule of being invisible in a palace like this one. You must look like you want to disappear. For years now, Camilla had worked as a cleaner, waking before dawn and finishing after nightfall, sweeping floors walked upon by people who never learned her name. Her father had died from fever in one of the hard winters, her mother from heartbreak the spring after. At 16, Camilla had knocked at the gates of the palace alone, and had been let in only because the head of staff needed someone to clean chamber pots and polish mirrors without complaint. She'd never asked for more than that. Still, she watched. She saw the way noblewomen lifted their gloved hands to hide smiles behind fans. She noticed which gentlemen held their goblets too tightly, which lords carried the scent of desperation masked beneath imported colognes. She remembered every insult, every careless word that fell like crumbs at the tables where she had to clean. And though she never answered back, her silence was not submission. It was memory. Today that memory pressed heavy on her chest. 2 hours earlier, in the quiet hallway outside the east drawing room, she had overheard two noblewomen, Doña Teresa de Luque and her cousin Isabella, talking in tones of hushed amusement. They say he sent an invitation to one of the servants, a cleaner of all people. Can you imagine? Teresa had said, her voice high and delicate like porcelain rattling on a tray. Isabella had gasped, delighted. You're lying. Alejandro wouldn't. He would, and he did. Teresa had leaned closer. He plans to parade her before the court. A little joke. Can you think of anything more delicious? Camilla hadn't moved from behind the curtain where she'd frozen in place. Her fingers had tightened around the cleaning rag until the linen tore beneath her grip. Now, standing in the hallway just beyond the ballroom, she still wasn't sure what to make of the invitation. It had come folded, sealed in the red wax of the royal crest and delivered into her hands by a young page whose eyes had glittered with poorly veiled amusement. She had opened it alone, by the servants' stairwell, her hands trembling, her heart drumming like a bird's wings. It had read simply, "Your presence is requested at the royal gala this evening by order of His Highness, Prince Alejandro of Castilla." There had been no explanation, no instructions, no signature. The page had disappeared before she could ask questions, and she hadn't dared to speak of it aloud. But the look in Teresa's eyes and the cruel edge of her cousin's laughter had said enough. They expected her to be humiliated, a servant, a peasant girl from the olive fields of La Mancha, at a royal ball. Her fingers tightened around the handle of the bucket. The sun had begun its slow descent now, stretching gold across the mosaic floors. Somewhere down the corridor, a bell rang once, signaling the final hour before the guests would arrive. Camilla turned, intending to make her way back to the servant quarters and throw the cursed invitation into the hearth. But someone was waiting at the end of the hallway. Inez. The old seamstress stood with her back straight and her lips set in a tight line. Her graying hair was covered by a dark kerchief, her apron stained with threads and chalk. She said nothing, merely nodded and motioned for Camilla to follow. They passed through narrow corridors where the ceilings hung low and the air was thick with the scent of starch and wool. The workshop was a small room tucked beneath the west wing, lined with wooden forms and bolts of fabric. A single oil lamp burned low on the table, casting shadows on the worn floorboards. Inez reached beneath one of the workbenches and pulled out a carefully wrapped bundle. "It was my daughter's," she said, her voice flat. She never had the chance to wear it. She laid the bundle on the table and unwrapped it with reverent slowness. The dress inside was a shade of blue so deep it bordered on black. Its bodice was simple, its lines clean. The sleeves, long and narrow, ended in soft lace cuffs, and the skirt flowed with quiet grace rather than ostentation. It was not the sort of gown that would shout in a room full of glittering royalty, but it would speak. Camilla stared at it, her throat closing. "Why are you giving me this?" Inez looked at her. "Because you're going, and you will not go in rags." There had been no argument after that. Camilla had washed her face and hair in the basin, her skin stinging from the cold water. She'd brushed her hair until it gleamed, pinned it up in the style she'd seen noble women wear. Inez had helped her into the dress, fastening the laces with surprisingly gentle fingers. The gown hugged her frame in a way that felt unfamiliar. Unfamiliar, but not wrong. She could barely breathe. By the time the bell rang a second time, 15 minutes to the hour, she was ready. Camilla stepped into the hall once more, the borrowed dress whispering around her legs. Inez handed her a pair of gloves, worn but clean, and the shoes, just a touch too large. Camilla's hands trembled as she pulled on the gloves. Her heart beat so hard it was a wonder no one could hear it echoing through the stone halls. She did not walk through the main entrance. That was reserved for the nobility. Instead, she was guided by one of the prince's footmen through the back corridor of the ballroom to a side door hidden behind a velvet curtain. 2 guards waited beside it, one glancing at her with undisguised curiosity. At precisely the appointed time, the guards reached for the handles. The doors opened. For a moment, the music stopped. Hundreds of eyes turned at once, heads swiveled, fans stilled mid-air. Laughter died in throats. The crystal chandeliers glittered above the room, their light refracting into sharp-edged brilliance as Camilla stepped into view at the top of the staircase. The air was thick with perfume and heat. Everything shimmered, gold, ivory, silk. And in the center of it all stood the prince, tall, still, watching her. She began to descend. One step, another, then another. Each movement slow, deliberate, graceful. Her spine held straight, chin lifted. Not proud, but unafraid. The silence in the room grew deeper. Halfway down the stairs, her gaze found his. Prince Alejandro. He was smiling, but not kindly. He raised a glass as though to welcome her. And as she reached the final step, the sound of breaking glass came from somewhere behind the crowd. The sound of glass shattering rang sharp across the ballroom, like a sudden fracture in the silence. Somewhere near the banquet tables, a footman scrambled to retrieve a dropped goblet, the red spill of wine spreading across a linen cloth like a wound. But no one looked. No one turned. Every pair of eyes remained fixed on the woman descending the staircase in a dark blue dress that shimmered faintly under candlelight. Camilla paused only for a breath before taking the final step, the skirt of her gown rustling softly around her ankles. She walked toward the center of the room, where the polished marble floor reflected the golden glow of the chandeliers overhead. The scent of beeswax and crushed roses hung heavy in the air. Her gloved hands were still, clasped before her like a woman preparing for judgment. And in many ways, that was what this was. Across the ballroom, nobles stood shoulder to shoulder, arranged like paintings come to life, each one curated in silks and jewels, powdered and perfumed. Camilla could feel their stares pressing into her, dissecting every part of her that dared enter their domain. Some eyes glittered with amusement, others narrowed with contempt. A few perhaps watched with a flicker of something closer to fascination. But no one spoke. Even the orchestra had gone still, bows lowered, as if unsure whether to resume. And then, slowly, the prince moved. Prince Alejandro stood near the center of the ballroom, a golden goblet in his hand, his ceremonial sash gleaming across his chest. He was taller than she remembered, or perhaps it was the gravity of his presence that made him seem so. His dark hair was combed back in immaculate waves, the sharp lines of his jaw softened only slightly by the candlelight. He regarded her with an expression that held something unreadable, a tension coiled beneath the surface of a cultivated calm. He lifted the goblet again, a mock gesture of welcome. The message was clear. Behold the guest of honor. Camilla's gaze did not falter. She crossed the floor with deliberate care, feeling the eyes on her shoulders, on her waist, on her every movement. The gown fit her like a secret well kept. It wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to be. But there was something about its quiet dignity, the way the lace caught the light, that made it feel more regal than opulent silks ever could. When she reached him, she paused. He extended his hand. A test. She took it. His fingers were warm against hers, steady. He led her toward the cleared center of the floor where dancing was expected to begin. At once, the orchestra picked up their instruments and struck the first notes of a waltz, tentative at first, then swelling with elegance. The music drifted into the space between them like mist curling through a forest path. Camilla moved with him. His steps were precise, aristocratic. Hers, lighter, less trained, followed with determination rather than polish. She knew the steps, every servant did, from watching years of formal court dances from behind the curtains. But knowledge and execution were not the same, and she felt the tight rhythm of her breath trying to match the fluidity of his movements. Yet she held her head high. As they turned, the swirling patterns of her skirt drew a low rustle on the floor, like wind brushing across silk. A murmur ran through the crowd, subtle as moth wings, as if the guests were no longer certain of the performance. This was not the spectacle they had expected. There was no embarrassment on her face, no confusion, no trip or stumble or misplaced step. She followed Alejandro's lead with instinct and a strange kind of grace that did not belong to the nobility, but to something older, something harder. Camilla did not smile. She did not avert her eyes. She danced as if her life depended on each turn, and in many ways it did. Around them, the guests watched in stiff silence. The dance ended. The music stilled once more. Alejandro stepped back, releasing her hand with a half bow. There was a pause, too long, and then the first sound of scattered applause. Tentative, polite, Mocking, perhaps, but it spread. The tension in Camilla's chest did not release. From the edge of the dance floor, a nobleman stepped forward. He was lean, his smile sharper than his cheekbones, his eyes glittering with mirth that bordered on cruelty. The Duke of Avila, a cousin of the king's sister, known as much for his wit as for the damage it caused. He held a goblet in his fingers and raised it high. "To His Highness," he announced, "for elevating the art of amusement, and to our guest, exotic and unexpected. How delightful." A ripple of laughter followed, some nervous, some too loud. Camilla felt her spine stiffen, the blood in her limbs slowing as her gaze moved to the man. She took a slow step forward, stopping at the edge of the gathering, where the circle of courtiers held its shape like a cage. Her hand reached for a glass of wine on a passing tray, the goblet trembling faintly as she lifted it. The air pressed in around her. She turned to the Duke, her expression unreadable. "Exotic," she repeated. Her voice was calm, clear. She raised the glass. The laughter faded, and she drank. Not a sip, a full drink, until the wine was gone and the cup was empty in her hand. The silence that followed was not quite respect, but it was no longer mockery. The Duke blinked and then looked away. Camilla placed the goblet back on the tray and stepped back into the crowd. Behind her, the prince watched with a strange stillness, his hand at his side curling slightly as though to reach for something. But he didn't move. The circle began to dissolve, the tension breaking in uncertain murmurs. Conversations resumed in low voices. Another dance began, this time with more hesitance, and couples slowly moved onto the floor. Camilla turned to leave the center. She didn't walk toward the exits. Instead, she moved through the side of the ballroom, tracing the curve of the columns that framed the outer edge. The music carried on behind her, lighter now, but no less artificial. She felt its rhythm like a distant pulse, separate from her own. She stopped at the terrace doors, where sheer drapes fluttered in the faint breeze that drifted in from the courtyard. A sliver of night air touched her face, and she stepped outside. The shift in temperature was immediate, cool, clean, and quiet. The stone beneath her feet still held the heat of the day, but the air smelled of orange blossoms and distant rain. The courtyard stretched in shadow, lit only by a few torches flickering in the sconces. Far beyond, the faint hum of cicadas. For the first time since descending the staircase, Camilla allowed herself to breathe. But it didn't last. Footsteps sounded behind her, measured, deliberate. She turned. Alejandro stood at the threshold, half lit by the torch behind him. The shadows clung to the angles of his face, but his eyes were sharply visible. Neither of them spoke. She waited for mockery, for triumph, for curiosity. Instead, there was something else in his expression. A tightness. A flicker of something he hadn't meant to feel. Still, she didn't trust it. He took a step forward. She didn't move. But before he could reach her, a voice called from the interior of the ballroom, sharp and clipped, the tone of someone used to being obeyed. A servant appeared at the edge of the doorway, eyes darting between the two. "Your Highness," the man said. "The Marquis of Figueroa requests your attention. It's urgent." Alejandro's jaw tensed. He hesitated, his gaze flicking once more to Camilla, and then he turned without a word and disappeared back inside. She remained still, the air brushing across her skin like a warning. Her fingers curled around the stone railing. The faint scent of the night's flowers clung to her gloves, but she barely noticed. She needed distance, not just from the prince, but from all of it. The hole, the stairs, the velvet cruelty of it all. She stepped back from the balustrade and turned, heading deeper into the terrace, where ivy climbed the walls and the darkness thickened. But she wasn't alone. From the shadows behind the tall windows, someone else had followed her. The faint scrape of a shoe on stone, the soft rustle of silk. She stopped. And when she turned, a woman was standing there, dressed in emerald satin and staring at her with eyes the color of wet iron. You stole something that never belonged to you." The woman's voice was cool and sharp, like the edge of a blade slid slowly through silk. Camilla's body stiffened, the words slicing through the heavy quiet of the terrace. The light from the ballroom spilled across the flagstones in fractured gold, but the woman remained just outside its reach, framed by shadow. Her posture was regal and unmoving, her gloved hands still at her sides, yet everything about her radiated hostility. "I beg your pardon?" Camilla asked quietly, though she already knew the answer wasn't truly a question. The woman stepped forward into the thin crescent of light, revealing a striking face, pale skin, hair the color of polished copper pinned in an elaborate coil, and eyes, cold, steady, gray as steel. Her dress was unmistakable, deep emerald satin with black embroidery, elegant without being ostentatious. It was not the garment of a guest, but of someone who belonged. Every stitch was confidence. Every detail, deliberate. "I said you stole something," she repeated, her gaze resting on Camilla's face, then sweeping lower, as though taking stock of the borrowed dress, the gloves, the hair combs that no longer quite held their place. "Not a trinket, not even a gown. What you took was attention." Camilla didn't reply at once. Her breathing had slowed, but her heart thudded hard against her ribs. She'd known someone would say it. She just hadn't expected it to be a woman. "I didn't take anything," she said after a pause. "I was invited." A flicker of amusement crossed the woman's lips, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Yes, you were. Summoned, like a jester in the court of fools. And here you are, dressed in another woman's memory, playing queen for a night." Her voice was soft, but each word struck with surgical precision. The insult was not in the tone. It was in the precision of observation. Camilla clenched her hands together in front of her, fighting to keep her posture from giving away the churn beneath her skin. "I don't know who you are," Camilla said, "but you don't know me either." "Don't I?" The woman stepped closer. "I know your kind. You pretend to be humble, but wear pride like perfume. You think you're brave for stepping into a world that doesn't want you. But bravery without understanding is just arrogance." Camilla didn't move. "Then tell me what it is I don't understand." The woman tilted her head slightly. "You think the prince saw you. He didn't. He used you. And when you're no longer amusing, he'll forget you ever existed." The words struck deep, not because they were shocking, but because they echoed every warning Camilla had told herself. Still, she refused to let this stranger see the effect. The woman's certainty came from a place of experience, of entitlement. Camilla could feel it in the way she looked at her, not just as an outsider, but as a threat that should not have dared to stand in the light. The music from inside had changed again, louder now, faster. Another dance had begun, laughter riding above the violins. But here in the shadows, time felt slower. "I didn't ask for any of this," Camilla said. Her voice was level, but tight. "I never wanted his attention." The woman studied her for a moment. "Then why did you come? You had a choice. You could have stayed where you belong, but you walked into the fire like you thought it wouldn't burn." Camilla couldn't answer. She didn't have to. The woman gave a short, bitter laugh and turned as if to leave. But before she stepped away, she said, "Remember this. What begins as a performance can end as a punishment, and in this palace mercy is always reserved for those born into it." Then she was gone, her dress sweeping behind her like a shadow returning to the dark. Camilla stood still, the words sinking deep into her bones. Her palms were damp inside the gloves. She let out a slow breath, unsure whether it was defiance or doubt she felt rising in her chest. Perhaps both. Either way, she wasn't ready to return inside. Not yet. She turned away from the terrace entrance and walked farther into the gardens. The night air cooled her skin, but not her thoughts. She moved down a narrow path lined with trimmed hedges, the gravel crunching faintly beneath her borrowed shoes. Gas lanterns hung at intervals, casting soft halos of amber light that didn't quite reach the garden's edges. Here, the palace felt farther away, its glow dimmed by the distance. Here, the silence was deeper. Camilla stopped beside a low stone wall where a cluster of roses climbed the trellis. White blooms, full and fragrant, some beginning to wilt under the weight of the day's heat. She rested her hand lightly on the stone, trying to steady her thoughts. The voice of the woman echoed again in her mind. She wasn't wrong. Not completely. But it didn't make her right. Camilla had not asked for this stage, but she would not run from it either. If she left now, the night would become what they wanted it to be. A jest, a spectacle, a cautionary tale for every servant who dared to stand tall. The wind picked up, stirring the petals on the roses and the hem of her gown. Somewhere in the distance, a clock tower began to chime the hour. 1, 2, 3 soft bells. The ball had been underway for less than an hour. It already felt like a lifetime. She turned back toward the palace, determined to return with her head high. But before she could take a step, a figure emerged from the shadows behind her. She turned sharply. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, was walking slowly down the garden path. His boots made no sound on the gravel. His posture was too relaxed, too deliberate. Not a guest, not a guard. Camilla took a step back instinctively. The man said nothing. His eyes moved over her face with a look she recognized all too well, a hunger cloaked in civility, sharpened by the knowledge of who she wasn't. She didn't know his name, but she had seen him before, in the halls, at court, laughing with other nobles, watching from the balconies. He stepped closer. Camilla's hand went to her waist, though she carried no weapon, no fan-shaped blade like the ladies sometimes wore for effect. "You're lost," she said, hoping her voice sounded stronger than she felt. He stopped, just inside the pool of lantern light, and smiled. "No, I'm exactly where I meant to be." Her breath caught. The garden seemed to shrink. The silence this time was different. He reached into the pocket of his coat, slowly, purposefully. And when his hand emerged, something metallic glinted faintly in the light. For a moment, the night held its breath. The object in the man's hand caught the light. A slender vial made of cut glass, no larger than a thumb. Its contents were unclear, though the liquid inside shimmered faintly with each step he took forward. Not a knife, not a pistol. But Camilla's unease deepened. The vial's presence was deliberate, almost theatrical, and its timing, his sudden appearance, his silence, his watchful smile, made her stomach twist. She didn't recognize him, not by name, but his bearing was unmistakable. This was a man born to comfort, groomed in wealth. His clothes were finely tailored, a shade too dark for the season, the sleeves embroidered in a pattern only visible up close. Every inch of him suggested entitlement, not protection. He came closer. Camilla forced her feet to stay rooted, though her body tensed for movement. There was nowhere to run without turning her back to him. And even if she screamed, would anyone in the palace hear her, or care? He stopped just short of her, letting the vial dangle between two fingers. "I saw you dancing," he said at last, his voice smooth and low, as if they were old acquaintances meeting again at an opera. "You made quite the impression." "I don't know you," she replied, her voice quiet but controlled. He smiled again. "You will." She glanced down at the vial, then back up at his face. His smile never wavered, but something in his eyes flickered. Curiosity, calculation, something sharper than admiration. "What do you want?" she asked. "You misunderstand," he said. "I've already taken what I want. I simply came to watch it unfold." He tossed the vial once, catching it with ease, then slipped it into the inner pocket of his coat. Camilla exhaled slowly, uncertain whether the danger had passed or merely shifted form. She stepped away from him, keeping her movements unhurried. Each inch of space between them felt like stolen safety. The man didn't stop her. She reached the edge of the lantern's light, and turned toward the inner garden path, intending to head back toward the terrace. He said nothing as she walked, but she could feel his gaze following her, as though he were memorizing each motion of her retreat. Only when she reached the curved hedge that led back to the palace did she finally exhale. Camilla didn't run. She didn't look over her shoulder. She walked quickly, her thoughts loud in the hush of the night. Who was he? What was in that vial? Why had he followed her, only to leave her with questions instead of threats? The ballroom doors loomed ahead. Light bled from the cracks, accompanied by a muffled waltz. The heat of too many bodies, the scent of perfume and candle smoke, beckoned through the thick velvet curtains. Camilla stopped before entering, adjusting the cuffs of her gloves and smoothing the skirt of her dress, which had caught a smear of dust from the garden path. As she stepped back inside, the music washed over her, bright and relentless. The ballroom had shifted since her departure. The tension that had once hovered in the corners had begun to dissolve into drunken laughter and tired smiles. Courtiers moved between the tables and dance floor in a blur of silk and feathers. A few heads turned to look at her as she entered, some curious, others cautious, but the majority had already forgotten. The novelty had worn off. Camilla threaded her way through the edge of the room, avoiding the center, where the dancing continued. She spotted familiar faces now, footmen pretending not to see her, maids stationed along the walls, their expressions carefully blank. They watched her as one watches someone crossing a rope bridge, knowing the fall could come at any moment. She headed toward the nearest door leading to the upper corridor, intending to retreat for a moment, to catch her breath in solitude. But halfway across the floor, a figure blocked her path. Prince Alejandro. His presence halted her like a wall. He wasn't smiling now. Camilla could see the storm behind his eyes, less fury than unrest, as though the night had gotten too far ahead of his plans. His uniform was immaculate, but his expression was taut, his jaw set with something unspoken. They stood in the center of a slow-moving tide of nobles, two fixed points in a room still spinning with music. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but before he could, a footman approached them at a near run, stopping just shy of propriety. "Your Highness," the servant said, breathless. "Forgive the interruption. There's an incident. In the garden. The guards have detained someone. It appears he followed a guest." Camilla's blood went cold. Alejandro's head turned sharply. "Who?" "The gentleman was identified by the steward as Lord Lorenzo de Santillana." Camilla froze. The name settled into her bones like ice. Alejandro didn't hesitate. He turned on his heel, already issuing orders to the guards nearby. He didn't look back at Camilla, but he didn't have to. The urgency in his stride, the weight of the moment, pulled her after him like a tide. She followed. The footman led the way through the main corridor and out into the west wing, where the hallway opened onto the outer terrace. Torches had been lit along the balustrade, and a group of guards stood clustered near the entry to the garden path. One of them held a man by the arm, restraining him without excessive force, though the tension in the grip was clear. Camilla recognized him at once. Lorenzo's cravat was askew, his coat rumpled. His dark blonde hair was slightly mussed, and a fine scratch marred his cheekbone, as if from a branch or a hand. His mouth curved in a smile that didn't match his eyes. "I was merely walking," he said, with an ease too polished to be honest. "Enjoying the roses." "Is that forbidden now?" One of the guards held up a small object, familiar and unmistakable. The vial. Alejandro took it from him, turning it over between his fingers. His face remained expressionless, but the silence that followed grew heavier by the second. Camilla stepped closer, watching Alejandro's hand close slowly around the vial. "Explain this," the prince said, quiet enough that the words barely carried. Lorenzo shrugged. "A gift, from a friend, perfume, nothing more." The lie was casual, crafted, but Alejandro's patience snapped. He stepped forward and struck Lorenzo hard across the face. The crack of the blow echoed against the stone walls. The guards didn't move. Neither did Camilla. Lorenzo staggered back a step but righted himself, a small smear of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. His smile never faltered. Alejandro's voice was low and sharp. "Get him out of my sight." The guards obeyed, seizing Lorenzo by the arms and marching him toward the far corridor. Camilla watched, unmoving. When Alejandro turned back to her, his chest was rising and falling with shallow breath. "You shouldn't be alone," he said. "Not tonight." She didn't answer. Couldn't. Everything inside her was spiraling too fast. The insult, the garden, the vial, the threat that hadn't been named. Her limbs felt weightless, as though her body might lift from the ground if she didn't hold herself still. "Come with me," he said. And before she could decide whether to follow or not, he was already walking toward the terrace doors. She trailed behind him through the empty corridor, past the statues and lanterns, into the quiet shadow of the royal wing. At last, they stopped beside a balcony overlooking the inner courtyard. The wind was stronger here, rising from the gardens below. The moon hovered just above the tiled rooftops, half shrouded by passing clouds. Alejandro leaned against the stone balustrade, one hand braced, the other still holding the vial. He stared at it as if willing it to yield answers. "I never meant for you to be in danger," he said finally, his voice quieter than she had ever heard it. "That wasn't supposed to happen." Camilla's mouth was dry. What was supposed to happen? He turned his head to look at her. "I wanted you to be seen." The silence that followed felt longer than it was. She studied his face, the tightness in his brow, the edge of guilt, the guarded flicker of something else. But she didn't speak. Somewhere in the distance the sound of bells began to chime again, and before he could say another word, a guard rushed toward them from the shadows of the corridor, pale and breathless. "Your Highness," the guard gasped. "She's gone." Camilla ran. She didn't remember the moment her feet began to move. She only knew the pounding rhythm of her steps against the stone floor, the tight ache in her chest as her breath caught high in her throat, and the way the shadows of the corridor peeled past her like curtains drawn open too quickly. Her dress caught on the edge of a banister, tearing slightly, but she didn't stop to look. She couldn't. Every footfall echoed with a finality that pressed into her ears. She passed a startled scullery boy carrying a tray of half-melted tarts, who turned just in time to see a blur of dark blue silk and desperation vanish down the servants' stairwell. She didn't cry. Not yet. The tears threatened behind her eyes, hot and unspilled, but she held them back. Her lungs burned. Her skin tingled with the memory of that man's smile, the threat hidden behind civility, and Alejandro's voice saying she shouldn't have been alone. He'd meant to humiliate her. But what had she meant to herself, agreeing to play along in his cruel game, thinking she could keep her dignity intact? The air grew colder as she descended into the lower levels of the palace. The marble gave way to older stone, uneven and cool beneath her feet. She didn't care where she was headed, only that it was away from Alejandro, away from the stairs, away from the realization that she had been a pawn in something she would never be allowed to understand fully. She reached the laundry passage, a corridor of low ceilings and wood beams stained from decades of boiling linens. It smelled of lye and iron and damp wool. At this hour, it was mostly empty. Only one washerwoman sleeping upright on a stool, her chin tucked into her chest, a basket of half-folded cloths at her feet. Camilla moved silently past her and slipped into the back hallway that led to the servants' quarters. The small room she called her own waited at the very end, tucked between a linen closet and the storeroom, barely large enough for a cot, a trunk, and a mirror nailed crookedly to the wall. Once inside, she closed the door with care. The silence was heavy. Her fingers trembled as she reached behind her neck and fumbled with the fastenings of the dress. The fabric was damp with sweat along her spine, the bodice too tight now, or maybe her breath simply refused to slow. Inch by inch, she freed herself from the gown. She didn't fold it. She couldn't. She dropped it over the cot like a shed skin and crossed the room to the basin, where cold water waited in a porcelain bowl. She plunged her hands into it, rubbing hard, as if she could scrub away the entire night. The soap stung the scratches on her palms, marks left from bracing against the garden wall. She pressed a towel to her face and breathed in the scent of dried lavender. Her eyes met their reflection in the mirror. She looked like a stranger. Not the Camilla who had spent mornings on her knees scrubbing floors and evenings breathing the same air as the noblewomen who wouldn't meet her gaze. Not the girl who used to tuck daffodils behind her ear during spring chores or whisper prayers to the moon when she missed her mother too much to sleep. That Camilla had been quieter, smaller. This one looked raw. She moved to the trunk at the foot of the bed and opened it, pulling out the only other dress she owned that hadn't been patched at the hem. It was a pale brown wool, threadbare at the sleeves, but warm enough for night travel. She dressed quickly, pulling her hair into a loose braid and pinning it under a scarf. She found the canvas satchel tucked behind the trunk, empty except for a folded apron and a worn copy of St. Augustine's Confessions, gifted to her by the palace librarian 2 years ago. She didn't add much more, only what she could carry without notice. A small coin pouch she kept hidden beneath the floorboard, a tin comb, and a slice of hard bread from the corner of her shelf. When the satchel was closed, she stood in the middle of the room and listened. Nothing. Not even footsteps. She slipped out into the hallway and headed for the back gate. Her path took her through the kitchens, where the ovens had long since been extinguished and only the night staff lingered, stirring pots of broth for tomorrow's feasts. She kept her head down, moving like someone with purpose. No one stopped her. At the stables, the air smelled of hay, sweat, and smoke. The stable boy, barely 15, nodded at her as she passed. She didn't need a horse. She didn't want to risk attention. She would walk. The eastern gate was guarded, but the timing was right. It was the last rotation before sunrise, the hour when deliveries began to arrive, and waste was carted out through the rear passage. A group of bakers approached with a wooden cart piled high with burlap sacks. She slipped in behind them, keeping her steps light and silent. When the gate swung open with its familiar creak, she didn't look back. The cobblestone road stretched out in front of her, washed in the blue haze of pre-dawn. The night was cool, the scent of dew already rising from the earth. Beyond the edge of the palace walls, the land flattened into olive groves and dry fields. To the east, the faint outline of the river marked the path toward the village. She began to walk. Each step away from the palace lightened her chest, but it didn't steady her hands. Her breath was shallow, her thoughts racing too quickly to sort. At the edge of the bridge, she paused. The water below moved sluggishly, dark and reflective. She rested one hand on the worn stone railing and closed her eyes. She had made it out. She didn't know what came next, only that it would not be this. Not the ballroom, not the dance, not the prince's gaze, too full of contradictions. She started to cross the bridge. The sound came slowly at first, hooves muffled against dirt. Camilla's body went still. Ahead, just past the midpoint of the bridge, 2 riders emerged from the shadows. Their horses were dark, their cloaks darker still, each embroidered with a silver insignia, a stag atop a field of black. She didn't recognize the faces, but the crest was unmistakable. The Marquis of Figueroa. The riders stopped, blocking the far end of the bridge. Neither spoke. Camilla stepped back, her pulse thudding in her throat. Behind her, she heard the quiet jingle of reins and turned in time to see a 3rd rider approach from the opposite end of the road, cutting off her retreat. She was surrounded. Camilla's heartbeat drummed in her ears, drowning out the river's soft murmur beneath the bridge. The 3 riders held their positions without a word, their presence unmoving, unnerving. The horses shifted slightly beneath them, the occasional snort or clink of tack the only sound between them. Their cloaks swayed gently with the breeze, and the silver stag embroidered on the fabric caught the faint blue light of dawn. She stood frozen at the bridge's midpoint, the weight of the satchel heavy against her hip. The stone beneath her feet felt colder now, as if the chill of the approaching morning had turned into something more personal. Her hands clenched at her sides. One step forward, or back, and she would be met. There was no way through. The lead rider on the far side dismounted. His boots landed with a dull thud, and he adjusted his gloves with deliberate care, as though he had all the time in the world. His face was mostly hidden beneath the brim of his hat, but Camilla could see the lines of confidence in his posture, the precision of someone trained not just in movement, but in intimidation. "You've had quite the evening," he said at last, his voice dry, measured, and inflected with the patience of someone used to giving orders without being questioned. Camilla said nothing. She forced herself to breathe slowly, evenly, though her knees felt unsteady beneath her. The rider stepped closer, boots echoing across the bridge. He stopped several paces away and tilted his head slightly, studying her face. "You were headed toward Toledo," he said, "though I imagine you hadn't thought much beyond getting out of the city." "I'm not a criminal," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. "No," he said, almost thoughtfully. "But you were at the center of a very public scene, and now you're attempting to leave before dawn, unescorted, without permission. It raises questions." Camilla met his gaze. "I don't owe explanations." The man's mouth curved faintly, not a smile exactly, but the ghost of one. "No. But explanations will be demanded all the same. And I've been sent to ensure that you give them in the appropriate place." Behind her, the third rider moved forward a few steps, not fast, not loud, just close enough to remind her there was no exit behind her now. She took a slow step back toward the bridge's low railing, resting her hand on the cold stone. "If you're here on orders from the Marquis," she said, "then it has nothing to do with justice." The man raised an eyebrow. "Careful. That sounds like defiance." Camilla didn't answer. Her chest rose and fell with each shallow breath, but she kept her spine straight. Another beat of silence passed before the man spoke again. "There's a small holding nearby. Private. It's comfortable enough. You'll remain there until His Grace decides how to proceed. You won't be harmed, provided you cooperate." Her hands curled against the stone. He gestured to the nearest rider. "Escort her." One of the men dismounted. His approach was quiet but quick, and before she could step away, he'd taken hold of her upper arm, not roughly, but with enough pressure to make clear she had no choice. She stiffened, but didn't fight. She knew what resistance would bring. They guided her off the bridge and onto a narrow dirt path leading northward through a sparse grove of olive trees. The land was quiet, brushed in pale light, with only the occasional cry of a bird to remind her the world hadn't stopped. After a short walk, they reached a low stone cottage nestled behind a cluster of cypress trees. It looked deserted from the outside, the shutters drawn and the garden untended. One of the riders opened the door and stepped in first, scanning the interior, before nodding. Camilla was ushered inside. The room was dim and cool, its furnishings sparse but clean. A table with 2 chairs, a fireplace long since gone cold, and a cot covered in a woolen blanket. A jug of water and a piece of hard cheese sat untouched on the table. The scent of dust and dry wood clung to the air. The man released her arm, and Camilla rubbed at the spot absently, though the grip hadn't bruised. She looked around once, taking it all in. "You'll stay here until summoned," the first man said from the doorway. "There's food. Don't try to leave." She turned her head toward him. "And if I do?" He gave that same faint, not quite smile. "I'd strongly advise against it." Then he stepped out, and the door closed with a final click. A bolt slid into place on the other side. Camilla stood alone in the silence. For several moments, she didn't move. She only listened, to the wind through the shutter cracks, to the distant rhythm of hooves retreating. Then, slowly, she lowered herself onto the edge of the cot. Her limbs were stiff, her feet aching. Her satchel sagged against her side. She dropped it beside her and clasped her hands in her lap. The sun had yet to rise fully, but light was beginning to leak into the corners of the room. It painted long slashes across the wooden floor, outlining her figure like a shadow caught mid-flight. Time passed. No one returned. She drank from the jug sparingly but didn't touch the cheese. Her stomach felt tight, too tight for food. Her mind chased itself in circles. What the Marquis wanted, why she'd been taken here, what message this was meant to send. Alejandro's name pressed at the back of her thoughts like a bruise she couldn't stop touching. She stood and walked to the window, pressing one eye against the narrow gap between the shutters. She could just make out the edge of the grove and the road beyond. No riders, no palace, just olive trees, and a sky warming from blue to pink. When night finally receded and the full weight of morning took hold, the door opened again. Camilla turned sharply. A woman entered, middle-aged, wrapped in a dark cloak with a white kerchief tied under her chin. She said nothing as she crossed the room, placed another pitcher of water on the table, and adjusted the blanket on the cot. Her movements were brisk and practiced, her expression unreadable. Camilla watched her carefully. "Will I be told why I'm here?" she asked. The woman didn't answer. She merely glanced once at her, then left as silently as she'd come. The door locked again behind her. Camilla sat down once more. The quiet thickened around her like fog. The hours bled together. Outside, birds called to one another in the trees. Inside, time stretched, slow and without shape. She didn't sleep. Not when afternoon arrived. Not when dusk slipped in like a whisper. When the second night fell, she moved to the cot, curling on her side and staring at the rough grain of the wall. The stillness was almost unbearable. She didn't know what frightened her more, being left here indefinitely or being taken somewhere worse. She drifted in and out of shallow rest, never fully unconscious, never fully aware. At some point during the night, a sound jolted her upright. Footsteps, boots, heavy and measured, approaching the door. She sat up quickly, pulse accelerating. The bolt slid free, and as the door opened, the dim lamplight from the hallway caught on the silver clasp of a coat she recognized instantly. Alejandro stepped into the room. The dim interior seemed to shrink around him. His shadow stretched long across the wooden floor, chasing the weak light of the lantern he carried. The scent of travel clung to his coat, dust, leather, a hint of sweat and wind. He looked as though he'd ridden through the night and hadn't stopped to change or rest. His uniform was wrinkled, the collar slightly loosened, and his gloves, one removed and held in his left hand, were creased from long use. Camilla stood slowly from the cot, her back straight, though her legs trembled beneath the weight of his presence. Her braid had loosened during the long hours, and a strand of hair fell across her cheek, clinging there with the dampness of sleep. He said nothing at first. Their eyes met in silence. The locked room, the shuttered windows, the stillness of the cottage, it all tightened around them like an invisible cord, drawing them closer and trapping them in the same breath. Camilla's voice, when it came, was hoarse from disuse. "How did you find me?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stepped farther into the room and set the lantern on the table with a soft clink. His gloved hand rested on the edge of the table for a moment, as if anchoring himself to something solid. "I've been searching since sunrise," he said finally, his voice low, tight with exhaustion. "They tried to lie. Your name was missing from the gate ledger. Your quarters were empty. No one knew, or no one would say." Camilla swallowed hard. "They took me before dawn." His gaze flicked to her face again, and something in his expression changed, like flint striking against stone. Not surprise, recognition, of how close he'd come to failing, of how near she'd been to disappearing completely. He moved toward the window, pushing open the shutter just enough to look out. The night air crept in, brushing against Camilla's skin like a warning. Beyond the grove, the wind had picked up, rustling the leaves in sharp whispers. The moonlight touched Alejandro's profile, casting half of his face in silver. "This isn't just about you," he said quietly. "Or me." Camilla watched him, still standing near the cot. Her hands had curled into fists without her noticing. "Then what is it about?" she asked. He turned back to her, the question hanging in the air like smoke. "It's about control. About showing me what happens when I challenge tradition. You were never the real target. You were the message." She felt the words hit her like cold water, not because they were unexpected, but because they confirmed what she'd begun to fear. "Why?" she asked, her voice thinner now. "Why did you do it? Invite me. Walk me into that room." His eyes didn't waver. "Because I wanted to see if they would look at you, if they could see what I saw." She stared at him, her breath uneven. "And what did you see?" Alejandro exhaled through his nose, but he didn't smile. Someone who didn't belong, and didn't care. Camilla turned away then, walking toward the wall. Her arms folded across her chest, her shoulders taut. "You knew it would destroy me," she said, her voice shaking. "You invited me for your game. And when it didn't go the way you planned, when I didn't break where you expected, you lost control. And now I'm locked in a house outside the city with guards at the door." "I didn't send them," he said. "No, but you gave them the excuse." The silence stretched between them. Heavy. Painful. Alejandro stepped closer. "Camila." She didn't turn. He paused. "You were right to leave. I would have left too." That made her look at him again, sharply. "You think this is about pride?" "No," he said. "I think it's about survival." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then he pulled something from the inner pocket of his coat, a folded paper sealed with wax. He extended it to her. She hesitated, then took it. It was a summons. Not from the Marquis, from the council in Toledo. "They're asking questions now," Alejandro said. "About Lorenzo. About the vial. About who knew what, and when." Her fingers trembled as she broke the seal. "They're investigating." He nodded. "They want statements, from witnesses, from you." Camilla's heart pounded. "And if I say something wrong, they'll silence you." The air in the room turned colder. She looked down at the paper. Her name was written at the top in careful, formal script. Below it, the date of the hearing, 3 days from now. "You'll have to speak carefully," Alejandro said. "Tell the truth. But not all of it. Not unless you want to be made the villain." She folded the paper slowly and looked up at him. "And what happens after?" He didn't answer. She crossed her arms again, her voice sharper now. "You think this is the end? That a hearing will change what happened? That I'll go back to polishing floors?" "No," he said. "I think you'll never go back to anything." Camilla laughed. Once, bitter and quiet. But he wasn't smiling. "I came here to get you out," he said. "Not to ask for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it." She didn't reply. She couldn't. He stepped toward the door, resting his hand on the latch. "We have to leave before the morning guard returns. There's a carriage waiting." "Not palace property. Discreet. You'll be safe, for now." She stared at him, her breath still shallow. He opened the door slightly, peering down the corridor. "Come," he said. "We don't have much time." Camilla moved toward her satchel, lifted it, and turned back to him. Her heart was hammering now, her blood rushing in her ears. She crossed the room slowly, the floor creaking underfoot. Alejandro stood aside to let her pass, his hand still on the door. She stepped into the hallway, the air colder here, sharper. And just as they turned toward the exit, a man's voice cut through the dark, firm, commanding. "Not another step." The hallway narrowed in an instant, the flickering lamplight growing colder beneath the weight of that voice. Alejandro turned first, his body coiled in a single motion, moving to place himself between Camilla and the figure who emerged from the shadows beyond the threshold. The man stood tall, draped in a coat of charcoal wool trimmed in silver, with the unmistakable sigil of a stag stitched just above the heart. The light caught his face, stern, angular, and deeply familiar. Camilla recognized him. The same man who had spoken to her on the bridge. The same measured cadence. The same eyes that looked through people rather than at them. "I believe you were instructed not to interfere," he said to Alejandro, stepping forward with the composed menace of someone who did not need to raise his voice to command the room. Alejandro didn't move from his position. His jaw tightened. "You were warned not to act without cause." The man ignored the remark, his gaze flicking toward Camilla. "She's under watch for good reason. Leaving the property now would be seen as an admission of guilt." Camilla could feel her pulse climb higher, her breath thinned by adrenaline. The satchel weighed against her hip, but her limbs felt too light, her body caught in a strange stillness, as if her bones knew any sudden move could shift the entire room. "She's not a prisoner," Alejandro said. "She was taken from royal grounds without a formal writ. That's abduction, not precaution." The man's brow arched. "You invited a servant girl to a royal event for the sake of spectacle. Don't pretend you're her protector now." Alejandro's shoulders tensed. "I'll file a formal petition," he said. "You'll do no such thing," the man replied, "because it won't reach the council in time, and by then, the matter will be resolved." Camilla spoke for the first time. "What does that mean? Resolved?" The man didn't answer her directly. Instead, he addressed Alejandro again. "You've made enough of a mockery of your position for 1 week. Now you're dragging this girl through diplomatic mud, risking conflict within the council. And for what? A whim or your guilt?" Alejandro stepped forward, his voice dangerously quiet. "She was threatened. By a man I warned your Marquis to keep under control, a man who carried something meant to hurt her." The man's eyes narrowed, but his voice remained even. "That vial contained nothing. You've blown it into scandal." "You think I care what was inside it?" Alejandro snapped. He cornered her in the dark. "That's all the scandal I need." The tension that followed was a tight, aching silence. Camilla felt it like a noose, each word pulling the knot tighter. They weren't just arguing policy, they were drawing battle lines, and she was in the center. The man stepped aside, just slightly. "She stays here. That's the last word on it." Alejandro didn't answer. His hand flexed at his side. One step. That's all it would take. One step, and they'd be at each other's throats. Camilla's voice broke the air. "Enough!" Both men turned to her. "I will go to the hearing," she said. "But I won't stay locked up like something contagious. I've done nothing wrong." The man smiled coldly. "That remains to be seen." She didn't flinch. "Then you won't mind if I speak for myself." His smile faded. "No one wants to silence you." Camilla stepped forward. "That's exactly what this is. You're not guarding me. You're hiding me. You want me out of the palace, out of sight, so no one remembers who I am." The man said nothing. Alejandro looked at her then, truly looked at her, and whatever argument had lived on his tongue faded. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice soft but steady. The man shifted his weight. "If you do, I cannot guarantee what will be waiting for you in Toledo." She held his gaze. "I've walked into worse." The silence that followed was thick with calculation. He could stop her, but not without consequence. Not now, not with Alejandro present, not with the hearing already summoned. The man stepped back. "This will not protect you," he said. She nodded. "Neither has hiding." Alejandro moved again, positioning himself at her side. He said nothing more, but Camilla felt the subtle shift in him, no longer behind her but beside her. It was a small thing, but it settled something in her chest. They moved down the hall, past the man's shadow, past the door, and into the open air of the courtyard. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of pine and dust. The carriage waited near the gate, simple but well-maintained, its horses snorting and stamping at the ground. Alejandro opened the door and gestured for her to climb in first. She paused at the step, then turned to glance back once. The man remained under the awning of the house, half obscured by darkness. watching. She ducked inside the carriage. Alejandro joined her a moment later. The door shut with a soft click, and the wheels began to roll. Inside, the air was warmer than outside, quiet and thick with the scent of old leather and wood polish. The space was narrow, just enough for the two of them to sit across from each other. He removed his gloves, setting them in his lap. Neither of them spoke for several minutes. The sound of wheels crunching against gravel and the occasional neigh of the horses filled the silence. The rhythm of the ride soothed her nerves slightly, like a lull between storms. Camilla leaned her head back against the cushioned seat. The weight of everything settled into her shoulders. The exhaustion, the uncertainty, the realization that she was now part of a machine she didn't understand, with pieces already in motion before she'd even entered the room. She felt Alejandro watching her, but she didn't look up. Eventually, he spoke. "You didn't hesitate." She opened her eyes. There was nothing left to wait for. He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. The trees outside thinned, giving way to flat fields and a scattering of low stone fences. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled once, marking the hour. Dawn had finally broken. The sky burned faint gold at the edges like a promise that felt too far away. "You'll be questioned," Alejandro said. "Hard." "I'm ready." His mouth twitched, not quite a smile. "You shouldn't have to be." She watched him for a moment, unsure what to say, unsure what she owed him, if anything. The carriage hit a rut, jolting slightly. Camilla braced herself, her hand catching the edge of the seat. Alejandro reached instinctively toward her, but didn't touch. She straightened. "How far to Toledo?" she asked. "A few hours at most." She nodded and returned her gaze to the window. The morning stretched ahead, long and uncertain. And just as the sun crested the horizon, turning the sky to flame, a rider crested the hill ahead at full gallop, cutting across the road with a standard flapping from his saddle, bearing the seal of the royal court. The rider approached fast, his horse's hooves throwing clumps of damp earth as he crossed the narrow road. Camilla leaned forward, her breath catching as the wind lifted the standard tied to his saddle. It was unmistakable, deep blue silk edged in gold, bearing the royal seal of Castilla, a single white lion at its center. Alejandro opened the door of the carriage before the driver could halt the horses completely. He stepped down quickly, boots sinking slightly in the wet soil, and held a hand up in greeting. The rider pulled his horse to a stop in a cloud of dust, dismounted, and handed him a folded parchment, the seal unbroken. Camilla stepped out behind him, the wind tugging at her braid and cloak. Her eyes flicked to the rider, no older than 20, face flushed from the ride, but composed. He bowed to her briefly before returning to his mount, waiting a short distance away. Alejandro broke the seal with his thumb. The parchment unfurled in the breeze, its script dark and crisp. His eyes scanned the page quickly, and the slight tension in his jaw gave way to something more thoughtful. "It's a summons," he said. "For both of us." Camilla raised her brows slightly, but didn't speak. "They've called an emergency session of the council in Toledo," he added. 3 hours from now." She nodded, her fingers closing more tightly around the strap of her satchel. Her breath was calm, but her skin prickled as though her body sensed what her mind would not yet name. This was the point of no return. They returned to the carriage. The driver flicked the reins, and the wheels rolled forward once more, this time with greater urgency. The countryside blurred past in streaks of green and gold. The morning air had lost its bite, warming under a sun that climbed steadily overhead. The closer they drew to the city, the more Camilla could feel the weight in her chest shifting, not lifting, but settling. Every field they passed, every bend in the road, brought them nearer to the reckoning. By late morning, the gates of Toledo rose ahead, carved stone flanked by guards in the red and gold livery of the crown. Trumpets sounded once from a nearby tower. The guards moved aside without question, and the carriage rolled into the city, its path already cleared. Inside the old quarter, the noise of the marketplace drifted faintly through the closed windows, vendors calling prices, carts rumbling, dogs barking. But it all felt distant to Camilla, as though she were moving through a story being told about someone else. The carriage stopped at the outer steps of the council hall, an austere stone building crowned with a copper dome that had begun to tarnish with age. Camilla and Alejandro stepped down together. A pair of clerks met them at the entrance, offering short bows before ushering them inside. The hall was colder than she expected. The marble underfoot gleamed pale, polished to a mirror finish. Their footsteps echoed as they were led down a narrow corridor and through a pair of tall, carved doors that opened onto a chamber filled with light and silence. The council sat in a wide semicircle of seats raised above the center of the room. 12 men and women draped in dark robes with silver chains across their shoulders regarded her without expression. A scribe sat at a low desk to the side, quill poised above parchment. At the center of the floor stood a single chair. Camilla hesitated for a breath. Then she stepped forward and sat. One of the councillors leaned forward, hands clasped. "Camilla Ortega de la Vega," he said. "You have been called here to answer questions regarding the events that took place during the royal gala held at Castilla Palace, as well as the circumstances of your departure and subsequent detainment. Do you understand?" "Yes," she said. Her voice was calm, but inside her chest, her heartbeat thundered. The questions began. They came one after another, some gentle, some sharp. What had she been told before the ball? Did she understand the nature of the invitation? Who dressed her? Did she know Lord Lorenzo de Santillana before that night? What happened in the garden? Did he touch her? Did he threaten her? What exactly did he say? Camilla answered each one clearly, slowly. She chose her words carefully. She told the truth, but not all of it. She described Lorenzo's approach, the vile, the suddenness of the... She described Alejandro's intervention. She did not embellish. She did not accuse. When asked why she fled the palace, she explained her fear, not of the prince, but of what the court would make of her presence, of how she had been looked at, laughed at, watched like a performer on a stage she hadn't asked to step onto. And when they asked if she'd known that her presence at the gala was meant to provoke, she hesitated only a moment before answering. "Yes," she said. "I suspected. But I also knew that not going would have been a different kind of defeat." One of the councilwomen tilted her head. "And what, in your opinion, was accomplished by your appearance?" Camilla looked up, meeting each gaze in turn. "They saw me," she said. "They saw someone who wasn't supposed to be there. And for a moment, they couldn't look away." The room went still. After that, the council called in Alejandro. He stood tall, his uniform crisp now, his face composed. He spoke plainly, recounting his actions, his intentions, never denying that the invitation had been issued to challenge tradition, to test the court's reaction to someone who had no title, no bloodline. He didn't excuse it. He didn't apologize on her behalf. "She never asked for this," he said. "But she carried it better than anyone else could have." The council dismissed them both with a nod. They were led into an antechamber where cold water waited on a tray and a single window overlooked the rooftops of Toledo. The city glimmered below, red tile and smoke curling from chimneys, the cathedral bell ringing out noon in slow, deliberate chimes. Camilla sat in silence. Alejandro stood near the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him. He looked different in the daylight, less untouchable, a man unmasked, not by scandal, but by choice. At last, a clerk entered the room and handed Alejandro a folded document, then left without a word. He opened it, scanned the contents, and turned to her. "They've ruled in your favor," he said. "You're not to be questioned further, and the Marquis has been summoned for formal inquiry." Camilla blinked. The tightness in her chest shifted again, softer now, though it didn't vanish. "That's all?" Alejandro held the paper a moment longer, then folded it carefully. "For now." She nodded slowly. The silence that followed wasn't strained. It was filled with something quieter, something waiting. He sat beside her. "I meant what I said," he told her. "That you didn't belong there. And you didn't care. That's why they feared you." Camilla turned her face toward the window. Sunlight spilled across the stone floor, warm and honest. "I don't know what comes next," she said quietly. "Neither do I," he admitted. She glanced at him. "Are we finished?" Alejandro looked at her for a long time. "Not unless you want to be." She didn't answer, but she didn't look away. Outside, the cathedral bells faded into silence, and the city moved forward beneath the sun. The streets of Toledo glowed under the last soft brush of sunlight, casting long golden shadows across the stone. The bells had finished tolling some time ago, and now the city had settled into that quiet lull between obligation and rest. Carriages rolled more slowly, their wheels softer on the cobblestones. The vendors had begun to pack up their wares, calling half-heartedly to stragglers, and children's laughter had faded into silence behind shuttered windows. Camilla stood at the threshold of the council hall, her hand resting lightly on the iron handle of the door. The parchment bearing the council's verdict, no further inquiry, no criminal action, was folded and pressed against her palm. A simple document, yet it weighed as heavily as a stone. She stepped outside, the light washing over her face like a benediction. It smelled of distant orange blossoms and old city walls, and the breeze caught the edges of her hair, lifting it gently from her shoulders. Alejandro walked beside her, his stride no longer formal, no longer marked by the stiffness of power or pride. His coat was dusted with the wear of the day, and his voice, when he spoke, was quiet, nearly unsure. "I've arranged a place," he said. "A small villa outside the northern gate. It's modest, secluded." Camilla glanced at him. "For me?" she asked. "For now," he said. "Until you decide where you want to be." She nodded once. She didn't thank him. Not yet. She wasn't ready to offer forgiveness dressed as gratitude. They walked slowly along the plaza, passing by tall colonnades and the scent of simmering stew wafting from a nearby inn. Alejandro stopped by a fountain whose water sparkled in the fading light. He looked down at it, as if considering something far removed from what he would say. "I meant to humiliate you," he said at last. "I won't dress it in fine intentions. I was angry at the court, at its rules, at how little I could move within them." Camilla said nothing. "I thought it would be a kind of vengeance, against them, against my own confinement. But you turned it into something else, something I couldn't control." A soft wind blew across the plaza, teasing a few loose leaves across the stone. Camilla's voice came slowly. "What did you think would happen? That I would fall on my knees, or laugh, or disappear before the dancing began?" Alejandro shook his head. "I didn't think far enough. I didn't expect you to command the room." She looked away. "And now you think you can fix it with apologies and a villa?" "No," he said. "I don't think I can fix anything. But I can tell you the truth, and I can give you the space to choose your own ending." Camilla turned her face toward him. His eyes for once held no challenge, no games, only a quiet, steady presence. "Then what will you do?" she asked. "I'll return to the palace," he said. "Face whatever remains. There are debts I owe. To others, to myself. And the court? They'll forget," he said, "or pretend to. They always do." Camilla nodded slowly. They continued on, turning into a smaller street where the noise of the city faded further. The paving stones were uneven here, softened by age, and the buildings leaned in as though listening. He stopped in front of a modest door carved with faded script. An olive tree leaned against the wall nearby, its trunk gnarled, its leaves whispering in the soft dusk. The house was quiet, tucked away behind ironwork fencing that bore no crest or mark. Anonymity, perhaps, was its greatest promise. Alejandro stepped aside, allowing her to approach first. Camilla rested her hand on the iron latch and stood very still. She hadn't decided yet. Not really. But she was tired. Not just from the road, or the questioning, or the fear. She was tired of being moved by other people's hands. Tired of being seen only when convenient. Of being invisible when inconvenient. She opened the door and stepped inside. The interior was cool, touched by the scent of stone and rosemary. There was a narrow stairwell to one side, and a window seat half covered in pale fabric. A basin waited near a hearth, and a small table with 2 chairs stood by a shuttered window. Simple, quiet. She set her satchel on the table. Alejandro stood in the doorway, watching her. "Will you come back tomorrow?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "If you want me to," he said. Camilla gave a slow nod. "Then I'll leave the door open." He stepped back outside, his eyes never leaving hers, and pulled the door closed behind him. The latch fell into place with a soft click. Alone, she moved to the basin and washed her hands slowly, the cool water sliding across her skin like memory. She peeled off the scarf from her hair, letting the braid fall free. In the stillness, she could hear the night beginning to settle in outside. The soft clatter of shutters closing, a horse's hooves against distant stone, a lullaby humming from some upper window. She crossed the room to the chair and sat. For the first time in days, the silence wasn't suffocating. It was space, room enough to breathe, to think, to feel without 1,000 eyes reading her thoughts. Camilla looked down at her palms, still marked faintly by the scrubbing of marble floors and soap lye, still healing from the rose thorns in the garden. She flexed her fingers once, and then a soft knock came at the door. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you like the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.